from what I heard from all of the colleagues around you, they were like, Ryan knows testing. If there's one thing Ryan knows, even Reed Davis, the founder of FDN, who we hung out with, was like, when I want to see if a new test is good, I run it by Ryan. He's that good at understanding testing. Hello and welcome to the Fusionary Health Podcast. It's your host, Dr. Shivani Gupta, and I have a special guest in store for you today. Ryan Monahan is a functional medicine practitioner. He is someone who I was introduced to at a conference recently, and everyone there loves Ryan, told me how incredible he is. And once I had lunch with him, I realized, wow, he is someone who's going to be my lifelong friend. He's brilliant. He's nerdy like I am and into his topics that he's into. So today we're going to dive into the topic of mold, which is pretty personal to me in my life right now. And it's definitely personal to Ryan and the journey that he had with his health. And we're going to jump into thyroid and other topics in future episodes. So welcome to the podcast, Ryan.
I am so excited to be here. And I'm so excited that we met at that conference. And I'm also looking forward to being good friends.
Yes, I've already been leaving voice memos for Ryan. Like, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? I think it's so incredible that we as this community of people who are into wellness, longevity, biohacking, integrative medicine, functional medicine, get to collaborate and work together and refer to each other and really find the best tools for everyone who comes to us. So Ryan is a big mold expert, and I want you to explain your story and share your story of how you became inadvertently an expert on mold. And then we're going to dive into mold testing, understanding mold and mycotoxins, what it means for your body and your health, and some of the tools people can use to win at their health as well as we talk today.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to kind of share my story there. And I said earlier before we started recording that mold chose me. I did not choose mold. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. It could really, really wreak havoc on your system and, contribute to just about any symptom or condition you can imagine. And so going back to, it was around 2008, 2009, I was living in North Georgia at the time. And I was a young, ambitious guy in my mid-20s, and I bought my first home. And I was on a budget, right? It was my first home. And bought a home that was much older. It was built in the 1930s, I believe, right? So really old home. And it was a fixer-upper for sure, but I was up to the task. I intended to kind of inhabit that home for a while, do some remodeling work of my own. And long story short is while living in that home, my health started to decline rapidly and diminish very quickly. And it was many, many, many years before I ever had thought to attribute those issues to the home. Okay. So during this time period, I was going to all of these different doctors and specialists trying to find answers behind why I was dealing with chronic fatigue, brain fog, depression, constipation, eczema, these kind of weird granulomas and skin rashes that were showing up all around my body. And each of these doctors or specialists had their own kind of take or answers as to what might be going on. Yeah. But nothing ever resolved. It never went anywhere. The fatigue started to become really debilitating to the point where I was sleeping 12, sometimes 13, 14 hours a night, only to wake up still feeling completely exhausted. And there were days that felt like years, which might actually be true, where I would just wake up and just stare at the ceiling and have no willpower, no motivation, would barely get out of bed. In some ways, it was almost a lost decade in my kind of mid-20s to my early mid-30s, where I had very, very poor quality of life. I would describe it very much as chronic fatigue syndrome, as it would be described as like that debilitating fatigue and brain fog. And eventually, what I found out, this was kind of like the beginning of my journey into the whole functional world. was I wasn't getting anywhere with conventional medicine.
Sure.
And I decided to try something different. And I found a TCM doctor. So he was licensed as a conventional doctor, but he was also licensed in traditional Chinese medicine.
Mm.
He ran a bunch of blood work on me. Okay. I felt like he actually really did listen to me, which was like refreshing in a lot of ways. And I got a call a couple days later when the blood work came in, and he said, well, here's what's going on. You've got Hashimoto's disease.
Hmm.
And I said, Hashi, what? What now? At that period of my life, I had no idea what Hashimoto's was. I barely understood what the thyroid was or what its job was in the body.
Yeah.
So we'll save that story maybe for the thyroid Hashimoto's podcast, but my thyroid was way out of whack. And I am absolutely convinced that the mold exposure, which I eventually uncovered, was the straw on the camel's back that broke me and triggered this autoimmune disease. I think it was highly related or mostly related to mold. So it was still another, maybe 3 years still after that diagnosis that I was able to figure out it was related to mold colonization and water damage in this really old home I was living in. And I had only figured that out because I took this path of becoming a functional practitioner, started attending all these conferences and webinars and learning more about mold. And I said, gosh, you know what? Now that I think about it, every time I come home from traveling, vacation, being at a conference, it's like it hits me like a ton of bricks where suddenly I'm like bedridden for weeks, could barely get up and move. Can't remember where I left my keys, my wallet, my eyeglasses, just walking around in a total haze. And then I started putting 2 and 2 together that, well, maybe there's something here. That maybe the home is making me sick. And that's when I started doing mold testing on the home and testing myself for mold.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. And it's interesting that you correlated it. Oftentimes we don't correlate it. In my case, when I recently realized I had mold in the house, I was smelling only in one spot in my house, a smell. And in 2020, we had a leak that I noticed. I called the handyman and I was like, can you just paint over that leak? I don't know why there's a leak. And he goes, you don't paint over leaks. You find out what the problem is. And I was like, oh, okay. Make a hole, whatever you do, figure it out. He made a hole. He goes, Shivani, can I be authorized to make a really big hole? I said, well, you're the one who's going to fix it. Go for it. Mm-hmm. He made a hole and he stuck his camera up and it was like a 20-foot looking wall of slime coming from upstairs to downstairs. And when I saw that video, I thought, we're going to die. I'm raising very young kids. We're just going to die. I don't know what that means, but mold is bad. That's all I know from functional medicine is mold is bad. When people have to detox from mold, it's really bad. Luckily, that thing was so contained where it was and we hadn't been exposed to it. So it got remediated and I was able to keep the kids very far from it. So recently, when I started smelling a smell again, I just assumed it was the same problem and it never got resolved. Thankfully, I went and investigated further, finally did mold testing on myself, mold testing on the house, and realized, okay, I have a problem. I'm testing positive for 14 mycotoxins. The house has a problem. It has mold in 2 places, including black mold. And so will you kind of talk about how mold occurs? Because I honestly think now that I've talked about this, every woman in my life is freaking out and calling my mold assessment guy who does third-party testing. He's super reasonable. And he's like, look, Shivani, we just test different spots, but every cabinet that potentially has a leak, we have to pay attention. Is this wood still wet? What are the issues? So I kind of, after that experience, thought, why aren't we all more intelligently safeguarding underneath every single cabinet of our homes and putting plastic boxes underneath to capture moisture? Because houses leak, sinks leak, faucets leak, and I didn't even fathom or understand what a problem that is. I just thought leaks happen. It didn't occur to me it could become mold, black mold, remediation, ripping out my laundry room.
Right.
And that even washers can have black mold. So will you kind of lay the land for people so they understand the level of mold they could be dealing with that they don't even know about?
And I was just like you when I had lived in that home in North Georgia, right? I didn't even if I knew there was mold in the home, I wouldn't have understood why that was a problem. or how that could be making me sick. But the truth is that mold loves environments that are dark and warm and moist and wet, like underneath your kitchen sink, your bathroom sink. And as soon as there's a water leak or water damage, mold can grow in as little as 24 hours or less. So it can happen very, very quickly. So when you have the first signs of a water leak or water damage, it is important to act very, very quickly. Thankfully, knowing this information now, during COVID, we had a water backup, a gray water backup in our basement. And it, like the second that we identified this issue happening, I called a water extraction company to come to extract the water. And they plugged in those big, huge industrial box fans to dry it out, right? So we want to contain these water issues as quickly as possible. Mold, which is a subset of fungi, right? Fungi is interesting. There are more species of fungi on planet Earth than there are species of plants. And unlike the plant kingdom, fungi does not require or need sunlight to grow. Right? So it can thrive in dark, warm, wet environments, right? And so we want to make sure that there's kind of three main things we want to get under control when it comes to preventing mold: is controlling the humidity. Ventilation can be very, very helpful. That can include everything from ventilation fans in your bathroom to even in your crawl space or attic, if that applies, which we don't often think about as much. Right?
Sure.
We want to keep air moving. It's really important. And then the third would be, humidity, ventilation, and then getting under any water damage under control. That can be a little trickier because you can't always see it. So I have a bit of a horrific anecdote to share with you and your audience, but it's really fascinating. So when I was living in this home, and I'll promise to keep it short, I know there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
There was this very strange phenomenon going on where every time I got out of my shower, I would sneeze uncontrollably. And when I say like uncontrollably, I mean like 40, 50, 60 times in a row.
Wow.
Like almost like a spasm. I sometimes refer to it as like an allergic spasm. And I kept thinking, like, am I allergic to the water? Like, what is going on here? So first thing I did was install a shower head filter.
Yeah.
That didn't help at all, right? Maybe it made my skin a little softer or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And maybe a couple years later, a friend of mine and I, we demoed that bathroom to do a remodel. So we tore down all of the tile, and behind the tile, all the insulation, every square centimeter of this insulation was dripping wet with black mold.
Oh God. And you just breathed it in.
It was a horror show. So it was inches away from my nose, and I literally couldn't see it.
Yeah.
And it was happening because there was a slow and steady drip of water on the pipe leading up to the shower head behind the tile and the sheetrock where I couldn't see it. Right.
Yeah.
So, mold can be kind of sneaky and sinister in that way. And that's why when I work with clients and I'm suspecting based on their symptom profile that they might be dealing with mold illness, and they'll go, "Oh no, there's no mold issue. I don't see any mold." I go,
Yeah.
"I don't care. That doesn't matter." Right. Frankly, and this is not, I'm not saying this in a judgmental way, but they don't know how to judge or assess the mold in the right way. Right. So they're making an assumption that there's not a mold issue without doing any testing, which is a mistake.
I agree. I mean, I have learned so much about mold, and I have chosen not to go deeper because my personality can get real obsessive on a topic.
Sure.
And I don't want to worry about my house all the time. But what I did realize was in the downstairs master, my house has a double master. In the downstairs master that I don't live in, the door had a seal on the bottom and it was never sealed. And so when my handyman went and tried to figure out what the problem was, he said, please don't remediate until you know what the problem is. Because you'll just remediate, you'll fix everything. It'll just come right back. Someone has to figure out the problem. So he pointed a water hose at the door and we watched, and water was just flowing in. And when I purchased this home about a decade ago, I put really nice carpet in because my husband and children just want to lay on the carpet all day. No one else needs beautiful furniture in this home but me. They all prefer the floor. And so that carpet was so big, beautiful, and thick, it never showed that Florida, which by the way, it rains half the year here,
That's right.
water was just flowing into that room and then soaking into the carpet pad. But I think we forget that any indication of water damage is not innocuous. There was an indication of water damage in that corner. The intersection of like the floorboards had split. And I was like, oh, the window must have leaked at some point. Who cares? This is my PSA to all of you. You see a crack, you see any indication of a tiny change in your home, not daunt yourself, but have the right people test and have the right people who know how to deal with things rip that open and investigate. Because that tiny problem that years ago could have been tiny turned into half the room had sopping wet black mold carpet padding underneath the carpet that could have harmed the person who was living in that room. So my point is, I agree with you. We are not good experts at mold in our home. And I'm curious next, what are some of those symptoms that you typically see people have that indicate to you that there's a mold issue brewing?
So first I want to set the stage here, just to kind of describe to your audience just how common these mold issues are.
Sure.
Because I think I wouldn't blame the average person for just assuming this is kind of like a fringe issue. It's not very common. This might not apply to me. Okay, so I believe it was the National Academy of Sciences did this big national assessment of mold exposure. I want to say it was about 10 years ago that this report was done. And according to their assessment, they found that 43% of homes in the US had active water damage, 43%. And 85% had a history, some past or prior history of water damage. So these issues are extremely common, so common that I test every single one of my clients for mold through organic acid testing.
Wow.
And I would say, although not most of them aren't necessarily coming to me because they think they have a mold problem, but they find that out through the process of working with me. Wow. And I think it's not unreasonable to say that about 25% to a third of people that I work with are somewhere on kind of the mold affected or mold illness spectrum. It's really way more common than people think is my point here. So that's my PSA, just to increase awareness. And if I had my way, according to this assessment, I think everyone should test their home for mold, right?
Do you think we should all not only test our homes for mold, but become really aware of the power of dehumidifiers, air purifiers, paying attention to humidity in different spots? Like, I think there's an understanding. Sometimes I think in high school, I know home economics is not a class that's offered anymore, but I wish that there was a class called home engineering management, because as a homeowner, I have to constantly learn all sorts of things. Today, the pool pump was doing something. So I texted the pool guy. I'm like, hey, this thing's making a noise. Any guidance? He's like, power off. So I'm turning off breakers. I'm trying to assess. I have no qualifications to assess a pool pump. But my point is, I think we need more knowledge in this area to prevent the problem, just like preventive health. So what are some things you pay attention to? Because I'm in Florida, land of humidity. Like, I'm assuming the majority of our buildings and homes have these issues.
I think that also ties into your previous question. I want to make sure not to skip that too. Is what kind of symptoms we'd be looking for if we are affected by mold, because that might tell you that there is a greater need to look into all of this in home, right? So some of the telltale signs I might be looking for might include fatigue, nasal congestion, headaches, skin rashes, respiratory issues like wheezing, coughing. Then you get into chronic fatigue, brain fog, digestive issues, anything that affects neurological function. That can include a lot of things from mood disorders to ADHD to even Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, neurodegenerative diseases. And that's because these mold toxins, they're called mycotoxins, they're incredibly tiny, like 0.1 microns in size, which means that that would be 10,000 times smaller than the width of a human hair. these mycotoxins, right? So they can get into every nook and cranny of your body. They can cross the blood-brain barrier. They can cross your cell membranes, right? They can travel anywhere they'd like.
Sure.
So Dr. Richie Shoemaker, he's often credited as being the kind of grandfather or the OG of the whole world of mold illness and CIRS, or chronic inflammatory response syndrome. And he characterized mold as a multi-system, multi-symptom illness, which I think is a really good way to describe it very broadly, because what he found in his practice was that his patients were, they were typically exhibiting like a laundry list. I call it a laundry list of symptoms. And that in and of itself to me can be a red flag for like, wow, this person, where do I even start? They've got it. Sure. One or two or more autoimmune diagnosis, chronic fatigue, GI issues, eczema. That actually in and of itself will be a clue to me that someone might be dealing with mold issues. The fatigue would be a big one. Any kind of sinus issues in my mind, that's a mold issue to me until proven otherwise.
Okay.
I used to not be able to get through a single day without using an inhaler. Okay. I haven't touched an inhaler in maybe 7 years. I haven't even touched one. I don't even have one in the home.
Wow.
Right. And, I was sort of thinking I was condemned to just a lifetime of chronic allergies and asthma and that sort of thing. So
what's interesting about what you're saying is if mothers are listening, who doesn't have a child dealing with some of the things you just mentioned? Every household right now that I know of has allergies, eczema, ADHD, and some of these things. And when I hear that, I always think it's the gut. Our guts are trashed. We all have gut dysbiosis. It's stress. It's processed food. It's inflammation. Everyone has to work on their gut. That's like our chronic leaky gut life. It would never have occurred to me to tie it to mold.
Oh, yeah. Yep. And, I do work with a handful of clients with who their children are dealing with autism.
Wow.
And there is I'm going down a little bit of a rabbit hole, but there's a known established link between autism and high oxalate levels, right? Okay. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with oxalate, oxalate, you could think of it as a type of toxin. If you look at oxalate crystals underneath a microscope, it looks like broken glass. Looks like it has a structure of broken glass. All plants, all fruits and vegetables and grains, they produce oxalate to varying degrees. Some in low amounts, some in very high amounts, right? And they produce these oxalate as defense chemicals. And fungi and mold do the same thing. They produce oxalate. So when you have mold colonization in your body, you are very likely to also have high levels of oxalate. They tend to go hand in hand. So you can't really get the oxalate issue under control until you get the mold colonization issue under control, which also means controlling the environment in which you're getting exposed to the mold.
Right.
So, point being there is that I do believe a high percentage of autistic children are dealing with mold colonization issues and tend to improve, and their condition and symptoms tend to improve and get better, typically in response to antifungal protocols or antifungal treatment.
You know what that made me think of? Post-pandemic, we see an explosion of autoimmune conditions. And of course, that can be attributed in many different directions.
We're trapped in our homes with the mold.
Yeah, I was just thinking we were really trapped in our homes in a way that we weren't at home before. And I wonder if we just had, like, for example, it was 2020 when we found the mold in my home and remediated it. And I was like, wow, the kids would never normally be home for any of that stuff. So, wow, that's an interesting correlation too.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it's really fascinating how much mold can affect your system. It's system-wide.
Right. Yeah. So when you talk about these symptoms and you talk about testing, so I know that recently I went through a rabbit hole of testing. I tested one kid's gut and I was like, whoa, I did not know you had those problems. Tested the next kid's gut and I was like, you're better. Thank God. No parasite, but you've got an issue. And I was like, well, if two people have those issues, I got to test myself. I did a gut test. My functional medicine doctor and I looked at it and we're like, she literally looked at me. She was, Shivani, what have you been doing? I was like, nothing. I just live my normal good life. She's like, something changed. And I was like, oh, I can't even tell you what it was. Then I get the mold report back and I was like, oh, got it. That's interesting. So mold testing seems to be confusing. Will you explain your thought process around mold testing and what people need to understand once they discover mold, how multifactorial the issue really is?
Yeah, so let's start simple. There are three ways to break this up into bite-sized pieces when we're trying to look at mold and how it's affecting you in a comprehensive way. At the most basic level, the number one thing we need to understand is that mold is an environmental issue, right? So if the health of our home is sick, and we think of our home as almost like a cell in the human body, and we're these little organelles living inside of this cell, like we're the little mitochondria or something, right? Well, if the cell is sick, all the humans, all the little organelles within the cell will be sick as well. Okay, so in some ways, that is the highest priority, the prerequisite to healing from mold illness is acknowledging that this is an environmental issue. You're dealing with almost like a biochemical house fire. So if your house is on fire, you don't just sit on your couch while your living room is burning around you and say, yeah, how can I change my diet here? What supplements can I take? Okay, that's going to do little to nothing to improve your situation. Now, there is a spectrum here. I don't want to induce fear. I don't want to make it sound like all mold issues in the home are that severe, right? If you're dealing with a more mild to slightly moderate mold issue in the home, I don't want you thinking that you're sitting in a burning house fire or something, right? But it's still nonetheless an important point to make. So step number one is we have to test the home, and if there is more than a moderate amount of mold, we do need to consider having a mold inspection done, and then plotting out a plan or roadmap for remediation.
Right.
Okay. Step number two is I want to see, are there signs of mold colonization in your body? If there's mold growing in your home, eventually you're going to be breathing in those mold spores. They can colonize your sinuses, which is why sinus issues are so common. And then those mucosal surfaces are connected all the way down to your gut. So eventually mold can colonize your gastrointestinal tract. And my favorite way of testing that is through organic acid testing from Mosaic. They're formerly Great Plains Labs.
Okay.
But it's a great way to assess to see if there's aspergillus mold growing in your system, fusarium mold, candida, and so on and so forth, right? So the third piece of this is to see if there are mycotoxins in your system. Mold is different than mycotoxins. They're not the same thing, even though they often get kind of lumped together because they are related. But mold is the living organism. We're talking about mold being a subset of fungi. So they're organisms that can inhabit your gut, just say like bacteria or parasites. The mycotoxins are chemicals that the mold produces. Think of it as like little chemical bullets they're firing.
Right.
And those chemical bullets, that's actually what causes most of the damage and most of the symptoms in your system. And the mold colonization is primarily a problem because it can continue to produce these mycotoxins. And those mycotoxins, to keep it simple, they are some of the most toxic chemicals you could possibly have in your body. They are massively inflammatory, like nothing else on this planet. And they are also highly immune suppressive. So one thing I'll often see with people with mold illness is they have this toxic burden, which is suppressing their immune system. So I look at their labs and it's like full house. They've got dysbiosis, H. pylori, candida, C. diff, parasites. It's like a full house, right?
Wow.
Why is that? Well, their system, they've become an ideal host, I like to say, for all of these different microbes because they have such a high toxic burden, right? And so those are kind of the three primary pieces. There's definitely more testing you could do to go down that rabbit hole, but that's typically a really good starting place. Testing your home, with something like an ERMI or an immunolytics test, doing an organic acid test to assess for mold colonization, and then a mycotoxin test to test for the chemicals, the mycotoxins in your system.
And what have you seen in terms of the testing and the results? Because what I find confusing is so many different doctors are using so many different tests. Like I go to one doc, I talk to lots of other docs, and people are ordering different tests. I'm getting different information, and it's really confusing. So over time, have you met with these testing companies, come to see what the data shows? From what I heard from all of the colleagues around you, they were like, Ryan knows testing. If there's one thing Ryan knows, even Reed Davis, the founder of FDN, who we hung out with, was like, when I want to see if a new test is good, I run it by Ryan. He's that good at understanding testing. And will you kind of highlight that time period where you spent just doing a high volume of test reading? Because one thing that I think is interesting in the functional medicine world right now, I go to the conferences, there's a lot of testing companies. And out of all those tests, there's different ranges. So a lot of times my friends are like, I went to the doctor and my blood work's fine. And I'm like, guys, there's different ranges of what's fine. With vitamin D versus and everything else, there's a lot of ranges and there's optimal ranges. And so have you slowly come to deduce that these tests are the best battery of tests to kind of run on people to get the best data and give you the most important information that you can then operationalize for them?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I love that. Yeah, so one question I'm always asking whenever I'm exploring the possibility of running new labs or kind of changing up my approach is always thinking from the perspective of the person on the other side, from the client, right? Because it's not about my ego. It's not about showing off my knowledge. It's not about just tinkering with labs for the sake of tinkering, right? The question on my mind is, in running this test, A, B, or C, how will that actually change the clinical outcome? Because I do think in many cases you can continue to run tests endlessly. You really can. And I do think there's a point of diminishing returns. And I do think that with those tests I mentioned, you'll likely get most of the information that you need without getting overwhelmed.
Right.
Especially if you have good intake. Good intake meaning you have a deep understanding of the symptomology of that client. And often I can tell, even without very much lab testing, to be honest, that this person may be dealing with mold illness, especially if there's obvious signs like, yes, my home or basement has a very musty smell, or yes, there is visible mold around the edges of my windowsills or in my bathroom, where, I mean, it's like, sort of like, come on, like how much, when it's that obvious, how much testing do we need? It's like, my allergies are out of control. I've got chronic fatigue. I have this autoimmune diagnosis. I can't lose weight. There's even some unique, almost slightly bizarre things that I'll look for. Like if you're waking up in the middle of the night, which is you'll often see in diabetics, right? But let's suppose you're not diabetic, you're not pre-diabetic, and you're having to wake up in the middle of the night every night to pee. That can be a well-known, I shouldn't say, it's actually not well-known. It's the opposite of that. It's kind of a little clinical pearl to potentially sniff out like a hidden clue for potential mold illness. And that has to do with how these mycotoxins can suppress a hormone called antidiuretic hormone, which is the hormone that at normal levels, it prevents you from having to wake up to urinate in the middle of the night. So, that all being said, I really do believe I try to stay humble, right? I'm always trying to continue to learn. I kind of operate by the belief of, strong opinions weakly held, meaning I have my opinions, I have my methods, but I'm always open to new information. I'm open to changing my mind about things, which I think is important if we're trying to be scientific and intellectually honest and have integrity. Also, I love trying out new tests. Like I'll try them out on myself as a guinea pig. I'll try them out on my friends, my family, to always try to be staying at the forefront and having a grasp of these sort of things. One last thing I'll say about the testing is, and some of the shoemaker trained doctors might want to wring my neck for saying this, but I think the CIRS markers, what we call the CIRS markers, which are blood chemistry markers to assess for mold. I very rarely ever do that. For two reasons. One is it's very cost prohibitory. A full SIRS panel is something like $700 to $1,000 for a small handful of like 4 or 5 markers. So we're talking about this sort of alphabet soup of MSH, TGF beta, MMP9, VEGF, right? So you run those markers, it costs a fortune. They tell you those markers are out of range, and then you go, then what? Right. Well, what remains the same, what remains unchanged is, okay, I still have to deal with this mold in my home. And in my opinion, you are better off allocating that budget to hiring a building biologist to inspect your home, putting that towards remediation, or even investing in like a high quality air purifier.
Sure.
Yeah.
And when it comes to mold, let's say someone said, you know what, I've got all the symptoms, and they came to you, you did the mold test, and you were like, yep, you have mold, you need to go figure it out with your house. Say they hired mold assessment, they found someone good. I've heard when it comes to mold assessment, mold remediation, you have to really be careful who you find, that there's a lot of games played there. Remediation can cost $50,000 to $100,000 if you're talking to certain companies. I got an estimate of $8,000, and honestly, for what I saw and understood was the problem, I thought that was a pretty reasonable number. And it's one of those things where, okay, you dealt with the mold. Let's say you got it out of the house and you replaced everything you had to. Are there other things that cause mold, and what exacerbates mold? Because from what I've understood now, food can drive mold, which I knew coffee and mold, and I knew peanuts and mold. So I don't drink coffee and I don't eat peanuts. But I've just recently come to learn a lot about grains and lentils and rice being a problem, which is a problem because I'm a vegetarian Indian. And then secondly, I heard Wi-Fi and certain things that we have in our home nowadays can increase our, like, let's say you had mold in the home, it can increase that growth 600x or something like that.
600, yeah, that's what they say.
That's crazy. We all have mold. Not mold. We all have Wi-Fi, and some of us have Wi-Fi extenders in multiple parts of our homes. And it's interesting, the place where I had a Wi-Fi extender sitting on the ground is the point from which the mold proliferated the most in the room downstairs.
Wow.
So it kind of indicated to me like, wow. So can you explain why? And then will you talk into the food piece as well?
Yeah, so the EMF thing is interesting. I think the theory goes that mold, if you have mold overgrowth in the home, that, mold is intelligent in a way, right? It's been on the earth for eons, right? And every living organism on the planet has a way of maintaining homeostasis and protecting itself. And the way I understand it is that the mold detects the presence of those electromagnetic frequencies as like a stressor or a disturbance. It's like an electromagnetic disturbance. And it's releasing these mycotoxins in even higher quantities as sort of like a protective response, almost as though it was detecting, let's say, competing viruses or bacteria in its environment. It's going to start releasing more of those toxins to ensure its own survival, right? So that's kind of how I view that. Now, what do we do then to protect ourselves and mitigate against that? I would say keep it simple. Start with, when you go to bed at night, put your phone in airplane mode. That's at least 8 hours of the day where you're not being exposed to it as much. When you talk on the phone, if possible, keep it at more of an arm's length distance on speakerphone.
Correct.
Don't be using those earbuds, please. Don't, no practitioner, especially. That's a huge pet peeve of mine. I see smart practitioners on podcasts and things wearing those earbuds, and it drives me insane. You can turn off your Wi-Fi router at night. You're not using the Wi-Fi when you're sleeping anyways, right? So I don't expect everyone to go back to like hardwired Ethernet connection. I've seen some people do that, but we have to kind of be realistic and meet people where they are. I think that's important.
Yeah.
The food component, it is very true that certain food categories or types of foods have a reputation for being contaminated with mycotoxins. When I have a client where on a mycotoxin lab report, they're clearly loaded up, let's say, on different, ochratoxin, gliotoxin, citrinin, whatever they might be, then we could look at those on a case-by-case basis. Certain mycotoxins come from food more so than some other ones. So, for example, fusarium mold is notorious for contaminating grains, especially corn. Corn is the number one culprit. And fusarium produces a mycotoxin called fumonissin. So if I see fumonissin levels high on a mycotoxin report, then I'm going to be highly recommending that person avoids corn in their diet, and even better, all grains, ideally. Especially, that might seem difficult. That may seem like a lot to ask. But if you're working with someone that's been, they've never made any progress, they're debilitatingly ill, and they've been chronically sick for years or decades, sometimes we have to do things that seem a little unconventional to be able to move in the right direction, right?
Yeah.
So nothing ventured, nothing gained might be a way to look at it. And so yeah, we have grains, we have coffee, would be another common one, dairy. And the reason for that is actually surprising. It's actually because of the grains that are coming up through the food supply. Yes. So that's why dairy products are contaminated with mycotoxins, because they're being fed grain and corn and soy that are contaminated with the mold. So they're kind of moving their way up the food chain now. Peanuts are notorious for harboring aflatoxin, which is actually one of the worst of all the mycotoxins. You might argue that aflatoxin is the most toxic out of all of them. Wow. So in some cases, I don't find it's always necessary, but if we're trying to approach it holistically, I'll have that individual also go on a low mycotoxin diet. And that may not necessarily be a lifelong sentence. It might just be, say 90 days or maybe 6 months, something like that.
Got it. Okay. So when I started to research this idea and understand, okay, Wi-Fi is a problem. That's a little tough. Sometimes the kid is in high school. She wants to do homework till midnight, 1 a.m, even though I'm the most pro sleep person you've ever met. So it's hard to time like when the Wi-Fi gets shut off at home. When it comes to food, I can do anything to my diet, usually. It's hard to get other people around us to change. When it comes to, your perspective as a functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner, what are some of those key strategies that you would recommend to people for detoxing? Because we can talk about fixing the home first. Obviously, that's the key. And we say home, but it could be your office. It could be any other space that you visit frequently. When I was researching, it said it could be your gym. You go to a gym. What if they have mold exposure and you're working out in that space a lot? I do go to the gym, not an hour every day, but an hour every other day at least. So that's one issue. Do you need to test your workplace? Maybe there's a ton of leaks in your work building, and those are the culprits. Is it your home? So let's say you remediated all of it, and it wasn't the physical external factor. Let's say you then went on a low mycotoxin diet, which sounds challenging to me, but I think, like you said, if you're sick, you got to do what you got to do to get better.
Right.
So you handle the food piece. What's next in terms of what do people need to understand are important aspects of detoxing mold out of the body?
Yeah, so the approaches are going to be highly individualized from one person to the next. I would love to say I could just kind of slap a template on every person and say, you're good, right?
Yeah.
And, part of that also is making sure first that we're nourishing the body so the body's strong enough to be able to detox from mycotoxins. And that might mean identifying nutrient deficiencies in minerals or vitamins, right? That might also mean kind of prepping some of these detoxification pathways so that they're more equipped to be able to handle that detoxification process, right?
Sure.
Generally speaking, and I am speaking very general here, kind of the number one thing that will always come to mind for mycotoxins will be binders.
Okay. Yep.
Different types of binders have different affinities for different mycotoxins. So when I look at a mycotoxin report, I might be able to identify, well, this person might benefit from zeolite. This person might benefit from humic and fulvic acid. This person might benefit from activated charcoal. This person might benefit from calcium deglucarate, or maybe some combination of all of the above, right?
Wow.
So we can actually get a targeted based on lab testing as to what binders will be more useful or beneficial for that person without kind of going into it blindly. My whole motto with everything I do is test, don't guess, right?
I love that. That's
Yeah,
great, because honestly, when I was looking at the project, I was like, well, Shivani, you're going to have to deal with the house. And then you're going to have to come up with a plan. And obviously
yeah,
the plan will involve, infrared sauna. You have to pick your binder.
yeah.
And my brain was like, you're not picking the binder just like that. You're not just going to jump to charcoal. Like, you need more data on this project, because otherwise you're going to go through a path, but you might think you're done detoxing and you weren't. So that's really great that through testing, you can see what's going to be the best binder to get the maximum impact based on what's really going on in the body.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. You can actually get a little more specific with it instead of just kind of, just throwing paint at the wall and hoping the right thing sticks.
Hi, I'm Dr. Shivani Gupta, and I created Fusionary Formulas because I believe everyone deserves a natural way to support their body's health. If you struggle with joint discomfort or stiffness, our Turmeric Gold delivers powerful curcumin in a form your body can truly absorb. It's science-backed with the highest quality ingredients and designed to support your body's natural inflammatory response. Take the next step in your health and wellness journey today. Visit fusionaryformulas.com and use code FusionaryHealth for 15% off. Fusionary Formulas, ancient wisdom, modern science, maximum impact. Yeah, and I love that you said, from an Ayurvedic perspective, we would never detox someone without preparing them to detox. So
Right.
I also love that you shared, we prepare them for the detox, because what if you're dealing with someone who's exhausted and depleted and completely
Right.
lacking all the support they need within the body to even embark on a detox? You're just going to further, it's not dysbiosis, but you're going to further throw them out of being in their balance or ability to even detox in the first place. The body has to feel safe to detox.
That's
And
right.
so how do you guide people on this journey? Like, what are those next steps you talk to them about? Because I think people underestimate the importance of customization and personalization. A
Right.
lot of the people around me are like, okay, well, what are you going to do? I'm like, what I am going to do is going to be completely different than what you need to do. I have a mycotoxin test that really specifically shows what happened. I have a house that actually doesn't correlate to that data. So my mycotoxin test said 14 types of mycotoxin in the body. The home just had 3 types of mold. The two don't correlate to each other. So in my opinion, responsible next step is test my office where I sit and do my office work. That's 1. Or 2, it's a big food investigation and understanding what that is.
Yep. Or both, right?
Or both.
Yeah, it's taking in all that information and forming a comprehensive plan. And that's really to answer your question, my approach and my practice is to gather as much lab data as possible between blood chemistry, hair tissue mineral analysis testing, organic acid testing, gut or stool pathogen testing, like the GI map, for example, is my go-to stool test.
Sure.
And seeing how all those pieces fit together to form a comprehensive plan. Because really, it's not even enough to just test for the mold in your body. Because if you're preparing the body for detox, we need to see, how is the liver functioning? How is the gut functioning? How are the adrenals? How could we support all of these systems, bring them all into tune, right? Kind of harmonize everything. I'm a lifelong musician. I grew up playing guitar and upright bass. I grew up playing in orchestras.
Yeah.
So often I like to think of it as like all the body systems are the different sections in the orchestra.
Right.
The woodwinds, the brass, the strings, the percussion, so forth. And in order to produce a harmonious sound to our ears and the audience, everything needs to be on time, in tune, and harmonious in synchronization.
Right.
So when we're trying to completely heal the body from the inside out, we can't really just pick and choose and say, oh, we have this symptom, let's try to treat that symptom or suppress that symptom.
Right.
Well, because that one thing could be related to 100 other things in your body.
Right.
I like to say last time I checked, we're one body, not a bunch of just separate parts and pieces. So
Correct.
my approach is to go really deep and comprehensive. I always tell my clients when they work with me, this is going to be the most comprehensive investigation into your health you've ever done.
Yeah.
Right. Which I think is what people are often lacking, right? Because they have these little pieces, little bits and pieces. They're not sure how everything fits together. So I do think, in my opinion, that is what's going to give you the best chance of having the best results, is having the ability to leave no stone unturned.
Definitely. And before we, started the podcast, you talked about how when you have an orchestra and you just focus on one area, when it comes to mold, there's a couple of different things there. And one of your categories was the nervous system. And I found that so interesting. You said, so will you speak into that and your 4 categories? Because nervous system, I think we underestimate. For me, when I understood, okay, there's a mold problem, I thought, okay, Shivani, you're a practitioner and you're intelligent. 1, you'll deal with the physical mold, get the job done. That's a team issue, handle it. That's an execution issue. Secondly, physically, talk to your best doctors. You know so many, figure out your plan. You're an Ayurvedic doctor. You already know the plan. You're just trying to get second opinions. Figure this part out, get it done. It was a very just finish the task idea. I completely underestimated the bomb that exploded in my life and dysregulated my nervous system, called fear of mold. So dealt with it. I was like, all right, we're done. It wasn't done. It's a very complex thing when you have mold because, like you said, it's in the air. So the fact that it was in a corner under carpet padding with Wi-Fi sitting on top, it's extended 10 feet into the room. Did the mold spores land on everything in the closets? I had to get that third party tested to confirm. Do I have to send 50 Indian outfits to the dry cleaners and try to get that issue fixed? Did it land on the books? Is it on the chair? I mean, I'm still not done. And I can't wait to be done with this project and feel secure that we're complete. And I think mold is horribly insidious on that piece. And we completely underestimate what that means. I didn't just throw everything out because we had sentimental attachments to everything in that room. But now I'm living in a 5-10% fear of are we done? Is it done? Or was I irresponsible by keeping anything in that room? So can you speak into that? Because I think that could be a big long-term issue for people.
Yeah. Yeah. So what you're speaking to here is what I like to call making peace with the mold.
Yeah.
I had mentioned earlier before we started recording that mold is ubiquitous. It's everywhere in our environment. It's actually virtually impossible to get rid or eradicate all mold from the home, right? This is part of the biome of the home, if you want to refer to it that way. So what we're really trying to do is get it under control to get it to be sustainable, right? I mean, and when we walk out our front door, I mean, we're breathing in millions upon millions of fungal spores, right? Many of which are harmless, right? It's the ones that tend to result from water damage that tend to produce mycotoxins that tend to be the most problematic, right? So there is this kind of tightrope high wire act when we're dealing with mold illness, where we're, on the one hand, we're sort of managing this very serious issue of mold colonization and mycotoxicity, which has real physiological effects on our system. On the other hand, I do not think that fear is helping in the equation whatsoever.
Sure.
Right? That kind of heightened nervous system response is just putting us into a sympathetic dominant state. And guess what? We don't do any healing or repair when we're in a sympathetic dominant state.
Yeah.
So we do have to try to find ways to compartmentalize a bit, right? Like realizing there's a mold issue, but staying calm and collected and saying, okay, what are the action steps I can take? I also like to say little by little, a little becomes a lot. So this doesn't all have to be done at once. It doesn't all have to be done in a month, right? We can take small, action steps and form a plan and work little by little until we achieve the end result, the desired result. That being said, there are a good percentage of my clients who are dealing with that more severe mold exposure end of the spectrum, where I've seen this phenomenon happen, where that individual, they detox the mycotoxins, they eradicate the mold from their system with the right antimicrobials. They may even deal with the mold issue in the home with remediation, or maybe they've even relocated. By the way, this happened to me as well. And I see this happen a lot, where people hit a wall with their symptoms. And, they start to wonder if they're still being exposed to mold, like what's going on here. And what's going on there, I believe, is that there's still a nervous system component to that healing journey that remains to be solved, that remains to be addressed. So I learned a lot of this from Annie Hopper through her program DNRS, which I send a lot of my clients to dealing with this issue. DNRS stands for Dynamic Neural Retraining System. And it's essentially a way to retrain your brain to say, hey, guess what? That biochemical trauma or threat, it's not here anymore. So a good analogy to explain this, what's going on here, is, let's say you've put out the fire in your body, you've put out the fire in your house, but the fire alarm in your brain is still going off.
Yeah.
Your limbic system in your brain is still sending the message to your body to create this crazy inflammatory cascade. It's a response that's no longer needed, or it's no longer proportional to the threat that's no longer present. So we have to systematically sometimes form a plan to retrain the brain to say, hey, like, thank you, brain, thank you, nervous system, for protecting me when you did, but we're in a safe place now. We're strong, we're healthy, we're resilient. We've got this, essentially, right? And yeah, I think that's in some cases almost a non-negotiable part of this whole healing process, especially from more severe mold.
Sure. I can see why, because had that been my room, I probably would need way more help to ever sleep in that room again. Like, it is interesting to watch my system and how I'm dealing with this and how my brain and emotions and nervous system are reacting. I woke up Saturday and I was like, yoga, it's Saturday, it's outdoor yoga day, it's going to be amazing. I walked out of my room and I was like, I smell mold. The problem is not gone. Full court press. And then I was like, Shivani, you're canceling yoga? I thought the mold problem was dealt with. And I was like, that's it. Every plant in this house has to go. I think there's mold in the bottom of the planters. And I was like, okay, calm down. We know. And I thought of you because we had this conversation in person. Don't freak out and then cause the same problem because you're going to be in your sympathetic nervous system. You have to stay cool, calm, and collected, be rational about it. I think it's just easy when you understand the danger of mycotoxins to react and overreact to the issue because it's an issue. And I can totally see why people relocate, because even when I dealt with termites in this house and I went with my pest control woman is amazing and she knows how to crawl into all these spaces. So I made new attic access, and then they showed me through video. Homes nowadays are not built intelligently for mold.
They're not
at all. Like, I think we are the most ridiculous society for how we're building homes. I have huge crawl spaces where, I don't know, bears could go live. It's ridiculous the amount of weird spaces that exist. Why? Why do we have that? Like, why are we not ventilating homes better? Why are we allowing... Anyway, that's a huge separate topic.
It is a big conversation, but I think the quick answer is that we've gotten in the habit with each subsequent decade of figuring out how to build houses more quickly and more cheaply to increase profit margin. It's just a numbers game.
Wow.
And so, building houses quickly and cheaply, as it turns out, is not conducive to avoiding mold issues in the home, right? So you look at like sheetrock and the paper that lines the sheetrock, well, that's cellulose-based material. It's a carbohydrate.
Wow.
So from the perspective of mold, it's like, that's
Food.
like dinner, that's lunch. Yeah,
So we're
right?
building mold food homes, basically.
We live in like Candyland gingerbread homes, right? And yeah, you combine that with poor ventilation in the
Yeah.
homes, or HVAC systems that are, improperly installed. That can lead to buildup of humidity levels and so on and so forth. There's only so much you could do about plumbing, right? A friend of mine who's a fellow practitioner, he's been working on building a home here in Colorado that's essentially like a mold-resistant home.
Nice.
He did a very deep dive on building biology. I don't know all of the details, but what he did share with me was that instead of framing the house with wood, he was using steel.
Wow.
And instead of using gypsum, or what we call sheetrock, he's using something called magnesium oxide board, which is highly, highly water resistant and highly mold resistant.
Nice.
So there are ways that this can be done. I would love to see these things being practiced more, but then you run into the issue of the homes costing more, and but then again, it's people say, pay your farmer now or pay your doctor later. Could we say the same thing about our homes? Like, invest in a mold-proof home or a mold-resistant home, or you pay for it later with mold remediation anyways on the back end.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Whenever I meet with vendors on my home, I always say, look, this is an asset. I hope to hand it down to my children. Let's treat it like an asset. I'm not here to be emotional about it. If the AC unit in the attic is only going to sweat, the water pan's going to fill, and I'm going to be texting you every other month begging to help me undo the failsafe so it'll just run before you come and fix the issue. How about we install a dehumidifier in the attic? Obviously, the unit is sweating. Like, think through logically what the problem is and then find the long-term preventive solution to not have the problem again.
Yeah.
It's just like health. Like,
it's
I
just
know my template.
It's the root cause, right? It's the same thing that I do in my practice. It's running the labs. It's not just focusing on symptoms, but going upstream to actually look at, why is this happening? How can we prevent this from happening again in the future? So the same thing applies to the home.
And it's interesting. I think we just underestimate it. In my case, I have these 2 units here. I'm working from home today. And the upstairs AC unit had a little bit of mold on it. But that master unit's AC unit covered in mold on the bottom. I'm in Florida. We overuse our ACs. We completely abuse them. And then they all give us trouble in the summer because we're trying to go from 100 degrees to 70. So we're not always running all the AC units. We just leave them off because we're like, oh my gosh, if I don't have to run a unit for the day because I'm leaving the house, let me not run it. But I think that moisture that forms on the coils between the coil and the filter is a problem that most people don't look at or understand until it's a big issue. So until I did mold remediation, I didn't understand my AC unit was a problem. Laundry room sink was a problem. Doors not being sealed is a problem. And so I can see how nervous system gets dysregulated because you're sitting in what looks like a leaky ship. And it becomes a game of whack-a-mole trying to prevent future leaky ship problems, right?
Yes, but on the other hand, through this whole process, which you've undergone over the past month or so, it sounds like you've learned a tremendous amount and have, worked on these little things that can add up to the bigger picture, and, kind of systematically addressing it, forming a plan, and which I think is what it's all about.
Yeah. And I think it's important to work with a practitioner like you to understand, and I will be working with you. We've already talked. I was like, hey, I need some help here to understand what is the right way to detox. Because had it been 1 or 2 mycotoxins, I would have been like, yeah, I got that. 14, and one is like poisonous to the brain. I read that. It was like, I'm not thinking too hard about you right now. I'm not looking at that problem. When it gets to that level, I'm like, who's the collaborating practitioner who can guide me so I can delegate the stress of the project to someone else who can be objective, right? Because when it's yourself, it's hard to be objective. And so I'm curious, what are some anecdotal stories you have around patients? Because obviously you're patient number 1. You found black mold in your shower. went on this mega journey to heal yourself. But have you seen clients come in where they were like, look, I just think it's thyroid. I just think it's autoimmune. I don't really know. You figured out it was mold. And then what was the recovery of that person from mold? Because I think we underestimate the constellation of symptoms we're dealing with at times and what the other end of that could look like for us.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And you're right, I was my own first patient in that regard. When I have a client come to me saying what you were describing, oh, it's just thyroid, it's just autoimmune, it's just eczema, I will diplomatically, gently push back on that and say, well, these things don't just occur randomly in a vacuum for no reason, right? They're distress signals from the body that there's something deeper going on. The symptoms are just almost a superficial manifestation of some of these issues, like toxic mold exposure in the home. So I've had more success stories than I can count. A recent one that comes to mind was a guy around my age, maybe a little younger, living in Southern California, that discovered he had mold in his apartment or condo. And he was dealing with some similar issues as to I was, to the chronic fatigue. He had a lot of wacky stuff going on with his lab work, like mineral imbalances. Definitely had a mold colonization pattern on his organic acid test, on his OAT, we call it. And it was really fun working with this guy because he was very compliant, and he was right on it. Just acted right away, hired a mold specialist to come in and check it out, form a plan for remediation, which was really cool to see. Because I will say, as much as it saddens me to admit, I have worked with more clients than I would have liked to say is true, that we uncover these issues in the lab and they don't act on it. It's just really, really sad.
How can you not act? You're living in poison.
Yeah, right. So it's a good question. I'm still trying to figure that out. And I think that there's some that don't believe it. As in, they don't really believe in the connection between the mold in their home and how it's making them sick.
Yeah.
Now, to what degree is that? Do they understand it? But it's denial, because I do think there's a denial component where it's people, they don't want to deal with the reality or the consequences of what's in front of them. And I realize it's very daunting.
It is.
Right? When we first discovered we had mold in our home, we ran an ERMI test. And that ERMI score was a 42. I don't expect anyone in the audience to understand the reference ranges there. But to put it in perspective, to this day, I've run hundreds of these ERMI tests with clients. This is an environmental test to assess for mold in the home. I still have not seen a score that high of a 42.
Wow.
Right. I'm not saying it's a competition, but I'm just saying it was extraordinarily high. Yeah. And when we found out that news for the first time, it was completely overwhelming.
Yeah.
I was still fairly young at that point. I didn't really have the budget to do all that remediation. It was a lot to take in. So I get it. I really do. I get the emotional component of it. But sadly, that is something that I have encountered quite a bit with this sort of like denial around the issue and an unwillingness to act on it. That's just me being honest.
I'm glad you are, and I'm glad we're talking about it, because that actually did happen to me. I can be very logical, and then I have a line for which I'm pretty illogical, and I laugh at myself. So in that room, my handyman was like, I've got this. Please don't hire the mold remediation company. What a waste of your money. I do this all day, every day, Shivani. I've got you. I was like, you've worked with me for half a decade. I'll trust you on this, but I'm stepping forward with some fear here, because I'm going to have to support this effort. He did the work, and I left the house because I couldn't bear to watch the house being ripped apart. So I left. I was like, I'm going to work. I'll be able to focus. Couldn't focus. Researched air scrubbers, rented one, and went back home to hand it to him to start air scrubbing, because I was like, I bet he doesn't have an air scrubber. I'm getting an industrial one. I get home, and he on the way, he calls and says, Shivani, I need to know what to do with all this furniture. And I couldn't process what to do, because we have an attachment to all the furniture in that room based on who lived there. So my brain did this thing where it was like, you can't get rid of it till you ask your children's permission. but it's technically got black mold. Like, what do you do? So I told him, just put it in the backyard against the wall of the house. We might keep it. And he's like, I don't think you're going to keep it. And I was like, just stick in the garage. I don't know what to do. So I get home and I open the garage and I was like, that's the smell of horrible, toxic black mold.
Yeah.
That has to go. I kept it in the garage until I could ask the children's permission. And my husband looks at me and he goes, why are you asking the children? What is going on here? You know you're going to throw it away. Throw it. So I can fully understand there's so much emotion attached to our things. It was almost like a fire happened in there because I lost control.
Yeah.
And that loss of control is not something we're used to in our daily lives. So I can sympathize because I'm working with functional medicine, and one response I got on my journey was, you need to eat meat. And I tried last year to eat meat. I tried sushi. I tried chicken. I've been vegetarian for 43. I'm now 44.
Wow, it's a long time.
So 44 years of not eating meat. It's not that I have a problem with eating meat. I don't know how to put that texture in my mouth without being repulsed.
Yeah.
That's a problem.
Sure.
So I want the protein. I logically know I need really great bioavailable protein. I want to let go grains. So I can totally see how sometimes we're telling the client, like, hey, that's the problem, just handle it. And the poor client's like, dude, you're asking for a mega shift, a shift in being. And that's a lot to ask all of a sudden. So I can see that.
Yeah, and I went through a similar journey where we had to get rid of most of our furniture. I don't think that's always necessary, by the way, but like I said, our ERMI score was extremely high. I mean, we could smell a big blast of musty, moldy smell every time we walked in the front door.
Yeah.
We smelled it on all of our furniture, our clothes. When I first went to a mold doctor, kind of trained in the shoemaker approach. This was in Atlanta. Pretty world-renowned, actually. His name is Dr. Dennis. And he developed this botanical solution called EC3 that's pretty well known in the mold world. So you can use it for cleaning your laundry. You could use it for as a household cleaning solution on your countertop surfaces. You can spray it on your drapes, all that sort of thing. I mentioned this story, though, because when I walked in his front office, he kind of stepped back and he went, whoa. He said, I smell mold on you. Like, I smell it on your clothes, which was really embarrassing.
Sure.
And he would not let me in his office. He said, stay right there. A few minutes later, he comes out from another room with a fogger, right? So a fogger is a machine about, 1 feet tall or so. It's a device where you put like an anti-mold solution, like his EC3 solution in there. And then you turn the machine on and it produces this big fog, like a mist, almost like a cloud, right? And it contains those mold antimicrobials. So he fogged me down in his office and he had me kind of do a 360-degree turn. So he fogged me front to back before he would let me in. And not only was that a little funny, but at the time it was embarrassing.
Sure.
And just kind of an anecdote of in some situations it can permeate everything, your carpets, your clothing, your furniture. One of the hardest things for me emotionally was I'm a music lover. I mentioned earlier I'm a lifelong musician. Getting rid of my record collection, all my vinyl, like all of it that I had taken years to meticulously put together. But I had to look at it like my health is my first priority. That is, everything else is secondary to that. And these are just things.
Right.
They're just things. And you know what? Not to get all existential on a podcast, but when we leave this earth, we're not taking anything with us anyways.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just hard though. I wrote a post about it on my Facebook because the day that happened, I got so emotional. I couldn't focus. I couldn't work. The person who lived in that room had just passed a year and a half prior to right now. And so when I picked up my kids and told them and showed them what happened, they burst into tears. Like the whole evening was them crying. And I thought, we really don't know the attachments that we each individually have to things and how those things represent people or things that we love. Like you're talking about records and you're a musician. I can only imagine what that means. We were attached to books because this person was an author. So it's so invasive. And I would call mold and mycotoxins a poison, but not just a physical poison. It can be like an emotional poison in your life. And
Yeah.
I think we underestimate that. So coming back to the beginning,
Hmm.
mold prevention is really important. And I don't think we should underestimate it. And we should all pause for a moment this year and put better mold prevention plans into place
Mm.
for our health, but also our emotional health, because this can
Right.
be way heavier and bigger than we realize.
It's very true.
Yeah.
It's very true. And it can wreak havoc on your health. It can uproot your life. And I said at the very beginning, it's not something I would wish on anyone. It's not something I would wish on my worst enemy.
Yeah.
One thing that I do try to aim towards in my practice and in the method that I'm using with my clients to help people heal is really trying to, it's almost a personal mission statement, is being the person I wish I had. I so wish I had that person when I was going through this journey with mold illness. I was totally lost. I had to figure all this stuff out on my own, and it was a lot of willpower. Um, and it may sound surprising to say, but 7, 8 years ago, roughly, is when we went through this whole experience. Back then, that doesn't seem like that long ago, but there wasn't really a lot of education or information. There's still probably not enough.
Yeah.
There wasn't a lot of information circulating around. I had just got lucky enough to kind of stumble on it. And the person that initially sort of mentored me on that was Dr. Sandeep Gupta. He lives in Australia. He's actually an FDN practitioner as well.
Cool.
I had attended a 4-hour in-person workshop on mold with him. And
Okay.
I'm giving him credit where credit is due, because he really kind of set me on this journey. But I was lucky enough to come across him as a sort of mentor. I realize not everyone is so lucky to have that sort of chance encounter. And so, yeah, I'm here to try to help it feel less overwhelming and less confusing to people, to run the right test, to help people form a roadmap. So that, what's the main benefit of doing that? It's going to save you time, energy, effort. It's going to compress time, right? Where, maybe it took me years to navigate that and to figure it out and to heal from it. I would want someone to do that in a fraction of the amount of time that I did.
Absolutely. And so when it comes to research and treatment protocols and all these mold related health issues, what is your dream or wish for the future? What advancements are you kind of most hopeful for? And I know you're a huge fan of FDN, because I hung out with you and you were at the FDN booth. And I almost feel like at this point in the world, we almost have to all become, it's not, I know for a fact we have to all become the CEOs of our own health. It's just mandatory at this point. And I think getting certification in health is almost going to become mandatory as well, for the level of health issues that so many are struggling with. And so will you just speak into kind of what is your hope, and how do you see FDN as a powerful way for people to get the support they need?
Yeah. So a few interesting things to touch on there. So as far as like the future of how we're approaching this mold issue, is the first thing that comes to mind is more prevention, right? I think so many people, and to some extent it's human nature, but we're more likely to try to fix the plane while it's crashing rather than doing a multi-point checklist, for maintenance before the plane even takes off in the air. And so, what would that look like? That would mean maybe, well, I always recommend anytime anyone moves into, whether it's an apartment, a condo, they're going to intend to put a down payment on a home, do a mold test before you make any kind of commitment to move into any home.
I agree.
Right? Otherwise, you could be walking into a world of pain, right? And that could be easily avoided with a small investment in running an environmental mold test, like an ERMI test, like the immunolytics test, or a number of great testing options out there. So that would be one. Prevention is so important. I think we should be doing genetic testing earlier in life, and we can potentially look at identifying if certain individuals are carrying the what we call the mold susceptibility gene, or the HLA gene. So about 24% of the population has this gene mutation in what's called an HLA gene, where, to keep it simple, they basically don't detox from mycotoxins very well.
Got it.
Right? So it's almost like a handicap. And those people tend to
check my test.
Yeah, it's only a one-time deal because your genes never change, right? So it's only something you have to do once. And that could be valuable to know if you're sort of a hyper responder to mold and mycotoxins, right? So it's almost like knowing you have celiac and you have to be extra vigilant about avoiding wheat and gluten. It'd be the same thing with having this HLA gene for mold. You can say, I have to be extra cautious, extra vigilant. I've got to have those air purifiers. I've got to have those dehumidifiers in my home. I've got to make sure there's good ventilation. Right? Those people are going to have to go the extra mile. Something I came across recently, I mean very recently, which I think is really cool. There are companies, one is called Sensio, I think that's how you pronounce it, Sensio Air, Sensio, and they make a mold sensor that can actually detect a handful of different mold species in the air. And then it pairs with an app on your phone, and it can send you alerts and updates as to the air quality of your home. It also measures, I'm looking at it here, dust mites, pet dander, bacteria, viruses. I mean, so it can get down to like 2 microns in size for what it could actually detect in the air. So how cool was that, right? We think about fire detectors, we think about carbon monoxide detectors, but how many of us are installing a mold spore detector in our home?
Very nice.
And so I think some of the technology coming out is really encouraging and hopeful. I mentioned earlier, I would love to see a movement towards not just mold, but just improving building biology and awareness across the board in terms of even like, circadian biology and the spectrum of light we're getting exposed to.
Yes, 100%.
How cool would it be, right, to hire a company that comes to your home and they audit all of that?
EMF, all of it.
Yes, EMF,
smart
light,
meter,
mold,
Wi-Fi exposure, grounding. There's a lot.
Yes, right. Like, are the outlets properly grounded? Is there dirty electricity in your home?
Yeah.
And I think we are seeing a small but growing movement towards more awareness around building biology and creating a home that is more conducive to our biology, to our physiology.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love that. Very cool. And any final thoughts before we wrap up on FDN or on the whole topic that we talked about today?
Yeah, well, so I would say to anyone that's scared or intimidated or fearful around some of these conversations, I really am an optimist. I like to say that everything is figure outable. I think we talked about that at the conference, right? The Marie Forleo quote. If I can live through severe mold illness, an ERMI score of a 42, a thyroid TSH level of 150, right, with thyroid antibodies in the thousands, and I can get through that and be here with you today and being, at least I think, relatively coherent, then anyone could do it, right? So I think your health is worth fighting for, right? We have this one life; it is a gift, and I want everyone to experience that gift of health and to move beyond the mold illness, the autoimmunity, whatever you're dealing with. So that you could put that chapter behind you and live your best life, live your most optimal life, right? And to start that business, to travel, to be more present with family, spend more time in nature, like the things that really matter, right? And that's what drives me. That's what I love about doing this work, is seeing those transformations and doing that FDN process of running the labs, test, don't guess, identifying these hidden stressors in the body, helping people to optimize their health. It's one thing to see the biomarkers on paper improve, but where the magic really happens is seeing people move beyond that, and then being able to tap into their own gifts to participate in the world and share their gifts with the world and to live their best life.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast today. And it's been such a gift to get to meet you. I went to that conference and you were by far the favorite thing that I got out of the conference was meeting someone like you, because you are so beautifully trained into pattern recognition and understanding that it's a whole body. So it's very much the Ayurvedic philosophy of I'm here to help you bring body, mind, and spirit into alignment. Let's get these interruptions, these little things out of the way. But you could tell that you're so beloved in your entire community of practitioners who consult you and come to you to help them on their path as FDN practitioners and things like that. So thank you for coming.
Kind of you to share. I really appreciate that. And yes, so that the feeling is mutual. I'm so glad we came across each other at that conference, and hopefully we can do this a bunch more.
I hope so. I think you are such a fantastic educator. Thank you, everyone who listened today and got to learn about mold from Ryan Monahan. I'm going to share I'd like for you to share your website, Ryan. Where can people find you?
People can find me at The Mindful Nutrivore. Nutrivore is spelled Nutrivore, and I'm sure they'll have that link in the show notes.
Exactly.
And I go by the same name on Instagram and on Facebook just to keep everything simple and consistent. I also have recently released a course for practitioners on organic acids and how to interpret the organic acid test, how to create protocols based on the results for that test. And I mention that because it's highly relevant to mold. That is one of the big advantages of OAT or organic acid testing, is being able to assess not just the mold colonization, but how it's affecting you, how it's affecting your mitochondrial health, how it's affecting your neurotransmitters, your detox pathways. So in a sense, it's like a functional lab test buffet.
Amazing.
So for any of your kind of health practitioners listening, that course is called Organic Acid Testing Simplified, and it's under the Holistic Health Experts umbrella. So I'll make sure to share that link with you guys as well.
Perfect. I love that. We need to continue to study and learn. And I love learning about all these topics. I think there's so much to understand about the body and optimization. So I love that you break that down in such great detail. And thank you so much for coming onto the podcast today. This has been so wonderful. Everyone definitely follow Ryan online. His content is incredible. I love meeting practitioners like you who are obsessed with their craft, Ryan. It gets me so excited. Everyone who has any questions or wants to learn any more about this podcast, it's the Fusionary Health Podcast, and my website is shivanigupta.com, where I have all the episodes from great practitioners like Ryan. And everyone have a beautiful week, and we'll see you next week on the podcast. Thanks for joining me for this episode. Check out our sponsor, Fusionary Formulas, the potent turmeric supplement used by doctors around the U.S. for patients with pain and inflammation. www.fusionaryformulas.com. I'm your host, Dr. Shivani Gupta. For more, visit shivanigupta.com. Subscribe to this podcast in Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Click the follow button or subscribe in any of the apps that you use. That's all I've got for you on the Fusionary Health Podcast this week. You have the power to transform your health and achieve vibrant health starting today.